Next game we're talking about is number 12 Ole Miss at South Carolina, 3:30 p.m. Eastern time on ESPN. Storyline is, okay, how does Ole Miss respond? Because the Rebels were on the wrong side of one of the biggest upsets last week. Despite being 15.5-point favorites at home, number 6 Ole Miss lost to Kentucky by a 20-17 final score. Now they're on the road against South Carolina, who's 3-1 on the season, and told them that one loss came to number 13 LSU, in which they missed the potential game-tying field goal with no time left. And LSU is only one spot behind Ole Miss in the AP Top 25 right now. And also, Robbie Ashford played a lot of that game because Lenore Sellers suffered an ankle injury. Lenore Sellers is back now. So it stands to reason that if Sellers played that entire game against LSU, South Carolina might be 4-0 right now. We might be talking about a team that's in the top 15 of the AP poll right now. So also, South Carolina, they're coming off a bye week. So they've had 2 weeks to prepare for Ole Miss. So I'm really interested in seeing how Lane Kiffin and the Rebels respond after being upset last weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. And they need to bounce back quick because this is a tough game. South Carolina's, that's a fun environment they got going over there. That's an elite defense they have, and they're starting to figure it out. They can really run the ball on offense, especially if Sellers is healthy. This is a game, if I'm Ole Miss, I'm a little nervous. I'm a little nervous if I'm an Ole Miss person or Ole Miss fan or somebody on the coaching staff, because you mess around with this South Carolina defense. LSU learned and won at the buzzer, basically, and we've seen from Kentucky learn themselves. Look, this is a team. Kentucky just beat Ole Miss. South Carolina beat Kentucky 31-6.
Yep.
They were just dominant in that game. I think everybody's on notice now about what South Carolina is capable of. This is a dangerous game for the Rebels.
Absolutely. So, Dawn, you have the Ole Miss offense who looked sluggish in that game against Kentucky last week. So how do they respond and how do they get back on track in this one?
So watching that game, it felt to me like Ole Miss came out and thought they were just going to do what they did in their first few games and just run the ball at will and take shots downfield and everything would be easy. And suddenly it wasn't easy, and then trying to find a rhythm against a very good Kentucky defense was a problem. Threw the ball deep a lot early. Jackson Dart's average depth of target in the first half of that game was 16.6 yards. And in the game, he only completed 1 of 7 deep balls. That was the ball at the very end to Caden Priestcorn on the miracle scramble drill on 4th and 11, and only 3.7 yards per design carry in that game. He scrambled for a handful of yards, but when they tried to run the ball, when they called run plays, it didn't work. And when they tried to take shots downfield, Kentucky, you could see Kentucky sitting back like, look, we're not just giving up go balls all day. Okay. Yeah. Here's the thing with Ole Miss. This has been a theme. When they lose, they don't run the ball, and they either take too many deep shots or it's just not effective. Let's go back to their 2 losses last year. Okay. Georgia and Alabama.
Yep.
Okay. In those 2 games, Jackson Dart went just 1 for 10 on deep balls combined. Okay. And they only had 4 yards flat per design carry in those 2 games. You take away the deep ball, and you somewhat take away the run game, the design run game, and you make Jackson Dart throw in a 15-ish yard bubble where he can't just, that he doesn't just have a Trey Harris or a Juice Wells or whoever just getting over the top because that's just what they do, double moves, running by you, whatever works. All of a sudden it gets choppy. And it feels like it felt last week like they were kind of punching a wall where it was like they weren't completing deep balls early. Then they have to figure out in the second half how to manufacture. And their best moments in that game are when they did. You could see it towards the end of the third quarter where they manufacture a drive. We run a little bit. We get 6-7 yards here and there. But Ole Miss gets impatient. And they want those big plays. They want those home runs. They want 60-yard touchdowns. And sometimes those just don't come. When you play a team like Kentucky with a good defense, like Bama, like Georgia, now like South Carolina, they don't just give you explosive plays. That's what makes them so great, is that you can't just line up and throw the ball 60 yards and walk into the end zone, right? So you're playing these elite defenses, and I think South Carolina's one of them. Look, we already know about their pass rush. Dylan Stewart and Kyle Kennard and all those guys they have up front. They got a freakish pass rush, and they've only allowed 10.4% of their opponent's pass plays to get at least 15 yards. I believe that's a top 25 mark in the country. They're really good in the secondary. They're really good with their pass rush. Ole Miss needs to find a run game here, okay? South Carolina, that's the one soft spot. We've seen it against LSU. We even saw it against Kentucky in a game they won. They had a lot of rushing yards in that game. It was just they couldn't pass protect against South Carolina. Kentucky, the pass protection's an issue. But look, South Carolina's allowed 4.7 yards per carry this year on design runs. 69th in the nation in run D grade. Ole Miss needs to come out and manufacture first downs earlier and create those shots with their run game, with the shorter passing game, drawing safeties up instead of just forcing home run shots down the field when teams are sitting back on them, because that's exactly what I saw last week, is that early in the game, they thought they were just going to run right by Kentucky, and it would be done, and the game would be over by halftime, and that would be it, and Jackson Dart had 400 yards in the first half. And then it wasn't like that, and they couldn't dial it back and play at the speed that Kentucky wanted them to play at. It reminded me so much of the Alabama game last year, especially. Alabama did not allow them to complete a deep ball, and this is what happens. Either they're going to manufacture first downs, or they're not, and if they're going to force shots and have Dart holding the ball back there against this pass rush, they're going to have another problem this week.
They absolutely will. And Dalton, I think there's a mismatch in that game with Ole Miss's offensive line against South Carolina's defensive line. It's the same thing on the other side of the ball. South Carolina's offensive line against Ole Miss's defensive line is a major issue for the Gamecocks. And listen, the good news for them is that Lenora Sellers, like I said before, is set to make his return. He was injured 3 weeks ago against LSU, sprained his ankle. But the bad news is he'll have one of the best D lines in the country breathing down his neck the entire game pretty much. Ole Miss right now leads the nation in defensive line grade at a 91.9, and the Rebels are first in run defense grade as a team at a 95.9, and tied for second in pass rush grade at an 86, ironically tied with South Carolina in pass rush grade this year. Ole Miss leads the nation in yards per attempt allowed at only 2.5 yards per attempt allowed, and they're second in the country with 113 total pressures this season. I believe only behind Miami this year in total pressures. 4 Rebels defensive linemen have earned 80-plus PFF grades this year, and Jared Ivey, Princely Monmielen, Walter Nolan, and Suntarine Perkins. 4 defensive linemen with 80-plus grades. That's nuts for them. And South Carolina, last year, what killed them and what killed Spencer Rattler was the offensive line was terrible. And their struggles have carried over into this season as well. So far, South Carolina's offensive line has a 60.9 grade as a unit, which is only at 99th in the country among 134 offensive lines. So South Carolina most likely is going to struggle to generate any push in the run game and also struggle to protect Lenora Sellers. And Dalton, a big issue with that too, if that ankle injury is still bothering him, he's not going to be as mobile and can't escape the pressure that much. So he's a sitting duck back there, honestly. If that ankle injury is still bothering him, we'll see if he does or not. But I'm worried about the South Carolina O-line against that Ole Miss defensive line, because that Ole Miss defensive line, like I said, is one of the best in college football right now.
Yeah, it's a huge question if South Carolina can get the run game going, because Sellers is such a big part of their run game. And 2 guys that I really like that you mentioned there for Ole Miss, Monmielen and Ivey, they were both really good last week. Ole Miss defense was good enough to win last week, and I know they gave up the last drive and the big Barryon Brown catch and all. They were good enough to win last week. I think any week that Ole Miss only gives up even 20 points, they feel like they should win, right? I think last week was on their offense. Their front 7 is playing a lot better. All those transfer guys, even Walter Nolan in the middle, is playing really well. I think better than at any point we saw at Texas A&M. Their defense seems to be good enough, right? Now they need to really get back into the creativity and doing a lot of things on offense that made them successful, instead of, again, just punching a wall and trying to get 60-yard bombs all day.
Yeah, definitely. So, Dawn, will Ole Miss bounce back after being upset by Kentucky last week, or will South Carolina establish themselves as a top 25 team in the country?
I'm staying on the Ole Miss bandwagon. I won't lie to you. I have Ole Miss 31 and South Carolina 24, but I'm nervous about it. I'm very nervous about it, because if you're trying to get your offense right on a week where they did not play well at all, this is not the team you want to do it against. Honestly, you've got this pass rush and Dylan Stort and these guys with your offensive line as kind of the one weak spot on your offense, and you've got the South Carolina secondary is really good too. It's a combination. Their entire pass defense is a problem. Once again, I think South Carolina, very much like the LSU game, if this game gets down to their speed, and it's about running the ball, and it's about defense, and it gets to be like the Kentucky game last week, this is a problem, because honestly, I think we saw it head-to-head. I would argue South Carolina is better than Kentucky. And now you're on the road. And that's a hostile environment too. And they're going to know, they're going to watch last week's tape and go, oh, they're vulnerable.
Yep.
I don't care if they're top 5, top 10, top 20, whatever. They're vulnerable. And they've shown it. And they've gotten the scary part to me for Ole Miss. Their last 3 losses, 2 last year and this one this year, they all look the same. We're not hitting deep shots. We're not running the ball great. You do those two things. I think Ole Miss. I've told you this before. How LSU turned that game around against South Carolina. You want to beat this defensive line, you have to run the ball well. You have to play with tempo. Okay, if Ole Miss can't get in a rhythm and can't get first downs and do those things, they're in big trouble. I'm going to stay on it. I think Lane Kiffin will find a better game plan than he did last week. I think Jackson Dart and Trey Harris and those guys, I think they'll have it enough together to win this game, but I'm very nervous about it. I will sit here and tell you of all these results, I might be the least sure about this one out of all of them because Ole Miss, there's a formula to beat them. There is in South Carolina. They have the tools to use that same formula.
Yeah, I'm a little more confident than you. I have Ole Miss winning this one 35-20. I think this would be a game where the defensive lines really steal the show. And in that kind of game, I just think if Ole Miss's defensive line could play as well as I think, and I think Ole Miss is a better offensive line than South Carolina does too. I think if that happens, I trust Lane Kiffin and I trust Jackson Dart and those receivers more than I trust the South Carolina offense to make stuff happen. So that's why I think they'll win 35-20. But I'm with you. I think it really could come down to which defensive line plays better, honestly, and because I think both will be dominant in this one. But I think that the Ole Miss one will be unblockable, whereas the South Carolina one will also generate a lot of pressure and a lot of great run defense plays. But I think the Ole Miss offense will do enough. I think Lane will do enough to mitigate those the damage that the defensive line does. So I got Ole Miss winning this one 35-20, get back on track after losing last week to Kentucky.